Conductor and cable types. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the most common types of cable we deal with as an electrician and what some of the more common names are for them. First thing we're going to start with is some basic single conductors. Single conductors, yes, of course, single conductors come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is an assortment of 14 gauge wire and 12 gauge. Comes in different colors and of course, different insulation ratings. Now T90 has the smallest insulation, and because of that, you can fit more in a pipe. RW90 is probably the most common and versatile. TW is a second place finisher. It's probably second most common. But what we'll notice from this selection of conductors, and it's hard to see from this video, is that all of them are solid. Now this would be pretty common for conductors that are smaller than number 10. But we do have conductors that we can specially order that are stranded. And so this here would be a stranded 14 gauge wire. And we'll notice when we do pipe fill calculations that stranded conductors of the same AUG size take up more area than a standard solid conductor. Now, of course, solid conductors come in either aluminum or copper, and this is a 2 gauge aluminum cable with RW90 insulation. This one is a 500 kc mil aluminum conductor. And then, of course, we get the really big stuff. This is a 750 kc mil copper conductor. All single conductors that are intended to be installed into conduit. Now, there is other types of single conductors that are finely stranded, and that would be an example of this. This is a TEW, insulated conductor. And this highly flexible conductor is made up of a significant number of individual strands. What else is unique about this type of single conductor is that the insulation is rated for 105 degrees centigrade, which means we often use it when connecting to equipment that generates heat. And finally, something like this, individual single conductors that are down around the 20 gauge that are used for instrument or equipment wiring. Again, these are still found in the code book. And if you want to find the uses and limitations of different types of conductors and cables, I recommend looking at tables 11 and 19. All right, well, that's single conductors. Let's look at something a little bit different. Let's take a look at non-metallic sheath cable. NMD90 or NMW or NMWU. Now, NMD means that the cable is rated for a dry environment. And that's what all of these cables are here that we're going to take a look at. Now, there's all sorts of different names that these are known by. We have Romex, Lumex, Heatex, everything with an X, it seems. And all they have in common is that they have a non-metallic or a plastic type of sheath jacketing around both the cables. And then inside there's a bare bond and a number of insulated conductors. And the way that we refer to these cables as is the gauge size and then the number of insulated conductors. So this one here has 3 insulated conductors and it's 14 gauge, which means it is 14.3. You'll also notice that the jacket is white. This one here is 14 gauge again, but both of these wires are black and red, no white. And because of that, this is often referred to as Heatex, and Heatex is used when we are connecting baseboard heaters or heating appliances that don't require a neutral. Now, it's not required that you use this, but it's most often chosen because the wire coloring is correct from the manufacturer. This would be referred to as 14.2. And then at the side here, this one has a yellow jacket, and this tells us that this particular residential cable is 12 gauge, and this would be used in kitchen counter receptacle wiring. And so this would be referred to as 12.2. Now, of course, we have larger cables that are used for things like dryers and electric stoves, and you can get this in aluminum if it's larger than number 8, or 8 and larger, I should say. Now, in the past, there has been some really old, archaic types of wiring like this that have a fibrous sort of tar jacket around the outside, and they have paper in there, which is somewhat flammable. And on the really old stuff, you'll notice that the bonding conductors are actually, well, non-existent or smaller than standard. This one is from the 1950s, and the bond is a 16-gauge bare copper wire. All of these cables are found in the residential sector of the electrical industry. Well, let's take a look at something else. How about an armored cable? And the most common armored cable that most of us are aware of, AEC90, is something called BX. Now, BX is simply a trade name, and the trade name comes from the manufacturer. Back in the 1950s, they had two different types of armored cable they were developing. One was called AX, the other was called BX. Now, the company went under and it's no longer being produced, but this is what everyone calls it. It has a plastic inner jacket or sometimes paper and a bare bonding conductor in most applications. What's unique about BX is that it has what's called an anti-short that needs to be installed whenever we are terminating it. This anti-short simply keeps the wire from rubbing against the sharp edge of that armor and causing a short circuit. Now, there's many more types of armored cable than just this, although the code book, unfortunately, doesn't distinguish. So let's take a look at another type of armored cable that would fall under the category of AC90. And the one that we're going to look at is something called TEC. So AC90 TEC. Now, what distinguishes TEC from other types of armored cable is that there are actually two rubber jackets. Rubber jacket on the outside, a metal armor that's the same as BX, and then an inner rubber jacket, and then inside is only copper conductors. TEC is only manufactured with copper conductors, not aluminum. When we're dealing with TEC, sometimes we have to put on a TEC connector that's used for a wet location, and something like this seals against the outer rubber jacket, and it has a threaded entry with, again, a rubber O-ring to ensure that it stays sealed. But wait a sec, you're saying, I've seen TEC that's aluminum. And I would say, ha, no, you haven't. You have seen ACWU, which is a far cry from TEC and a significant reduction in cost. This is ACWU. Now, ACWU, for individuals that are not really observant, would say, it looks pretty much the same as TEC, and it almost does, except for the lack of inner rubber jacket. There's usually a paper or plastic liner to it, and in addition to that, ACWU is only manufactured in aluminum. So a substantial reduction in cost, however, can't be used in every single installation that TEC would have been. So there is a difference between the ACWU and TEC armored cable. Let's take a look at another type of cable that's pretty common out in industry, the flexible cord. Now, flexible cord often looks like this. It's a insulated, rubberized, highly flexible cable that comes with all sorts of different alpha coating to indicate the type of conditions it's good for. Now, in the field, we often refer to this as cap tire, and it's used to build extension cords that would otherwise have been purchased from the manufacturer. Usually there's no space in between the individual conductors and the rubber jacket, and the conductor inside that's the bond is insulated. And so that means for this particular cable, these are 12-gauge wires, and there are 3 insulated conductors. This would be known as 12-3 flexible cord. A little bit different than what we see with the residential non-metallic sheathed. Now, on this cable, we should have things like an FT rating. This one's rated FT2. This one says it's good for water resistant environment, and SOOW. If we look up SOOW, it will give us information regarding this cable's use in hard usage or extra hard usage type of environments. Now, this type of cable comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, not to mention colors. And depending on the specialty industry that you might be working in, you might end up with colors like this. And you can also end up with very large flexible cords for portable power cables. Keep in mind, this is highly flexible, highly stranded conductors, which means we're dealing with copper. This is always going to be a copper conductor inside the cable. All right, let's take a look at another one. We're going to look at a neutral supported cable, or NSC as it's known in the code book. Neutral supported cable is used for overhead applications, and this is a good example. We've just got tape on here to keep it together. There are two insulated conductors. There is a bare bonding conductor, and one of them is just sticking straight out, and that's because it's not made of the same material. This is steel, whereas all of these are aluminum. And this is meant to support the entire span of this suspended cable in midair. Now, triplex, quadruplex, those are the two most common that we see, but it is possible to see duplex as well. And what they're referring to with the names is the number of total circuit conductors. This one has 3, line 1, line 2, and the neutral. Table 36A and 36B would be used in determining the uses for that type of cable. What about those of us who do some fire alarm work? Well, fire alarm cable is pretty common in the industry, and it can come in 2 different variations. It can either have an armor on it like this, or it can simply be the cable itself and no armor whatsoever. You can get varying numbers of conductors, but most often a 5 conductor or 4 conductor is seen in industry. Now, FAS cable is used for the wiring of fire alarms, and in the field we often refer to it simply as red jacket. It has a really high temperature insulation rating, and again we can find its uses and specifics in one of the 2 tables used for conductor uses and applications, which is table 11 and 19. Now, very similar to FAS cable is something called LVT. And although it says it's low voltage thermostat wire, often we use it for all sorts of different low voltage applications. It can have as many conductors as is necessary, but it has a voltage limitation on it, which means it can't handle really high voltage circuits. Now, as the name would lead you to believe, this type of cable is most often used when connecting a fireplace or furnace to the thermostat, but that's not its only application. Finally, the last type of cable that we have, or that we have in this presentation, is something called unshielded twisted pair. Gaining more and more use out in industry, this is a telecom cable, or just known as a telephone cable. The twisted pairs have to do with the colors. And in a twisted pair cable, there are 4 pairs always, no matter the category. And the 4 pairs are green, orange, brown, and blue. Now, it doesn't matter if it's Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5, Cat 5A, Cat 5E, all of them have 4 pairs. And although historically it's been used for telephone and Ethernet connections, we'll find that the codebook is allowing for more applications that utilize this type of conductor for power over Ethernet applications. So section 16 will deal with this type of conductor being used, not just for telecom, but for actual installation that supplies power.